You with Newsfeed. All right, big conversations as well from Jessie Duarte about the coronavirus. Let's carry those on. She said employers need to make sure that employees are properly looked after. And you'll know by now that the number of people in South Africa who have been diagnosed with this virus has now climbed to 13 today. Michael Yeates is the director of the employment practice of the law firm Cliff Decker Hoffmeyer. He joins me now. Michael, good afternoon to you. Thanks so much for coming in.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you for having me.
All right, when we start discussing the law, workers and the coronavirus, I suppose let me start here. Would it be fair to say that an employer has a duty of care to a worker? In other words, they have to make sure that the working environment is actually safe for that person to go into.
That's true. But look, I think I just need to dispel a common myth here. The Occupational Health and Safety Act is more geared towards a no-harm situation in relation to the employer's activities. The COVID-19 disease isn't really what we could describe as an occupational injury or an occupational disease or illness. So the Occupational Health and Safety Act isn't really geared towards dealing with the coronavirus as such. However, the Occupational Health and Safety Act does provide a general duty on an employer to ensure that the workplace is a healthy environment. And from a liberal interpretation or a generous interpretation, you can argue that an employer does have an obligation to ensure that it informs its employees of the risks and that it takes some reasonable measure to try and prevent contamination or infections from happening in the workplace. But to be honest with you, I think the concern is more of an operational concern, where an employer might find that half of their workforce is struck down by this disease, and that will have a severe operational impact on them down the line.
Okay, there will be some people, and they talk about self-isolation. In other words, you should stay at home unless you absolutely have to leave. At this stage, I would imagine a worker can't really demand the right to work at home because of coronavirus, or can they?
No, not really. It still remains the employer's prerogative to tell employees whether to come to work or to stay at home. Some employers have the luxury of doing that, depending on what their operations are. But there are a lot of employers out there that don't have that luxury. I mean, if you think of cleaning services or restaurateurs, where you actually need your employees at the workplace, they can't work from home. So employees can't demand to stay at home, but we would engage and encourage employees to have that discussion with their employers to see if there isn't some form of compromise arrangement that they could make.
Do you think that, I mean, the idea of working from home has sort of gained a lot of currency over the last 20, 30 years, and as more and more information technology comes through, as internet speeds pick up, as people get fibre in their homes, for example, they work in Sandton and live in the suburbs. We're seeing a bit of a shift. Are employers, are managers moving with that shift, or do they still like to see, you know, the faces of their employees every morning?
Well, I suppose it's horses for courses, Stephen. Look, I think one of the benefits, if you want to see it that way, of this COVID-19 is that it does prompt this kind of discussion. We've seen the 4IR movement. We're looking at the future of work, whether it is more beneficial for employees to work from home and what technologies can be incorporated to make your employees more productive. There are studies that show that flexible working weeks, working from home, can be more productive. But then again, we do have a situation where employees need to be at work if that is what the operational requirements demand of the employees.
Could we see the coronavirus, you know, pushing that process along a little bit? I mean, if not here, in other countries, in the United States, I mean, in Italy, for example, I would imagine everyone who wants to be productive kind of now has to do it from work this afternoon.
I believe so, Stephen. I mean, even now, some of the professional services firms that I've consulted with or spoken to, they have taken an active move to cancel face-to-face meetings, and they are encouraging Zoom or Skype type of web-based meetings. The general mantra is to try and create as much distance, physical distance, between yourself and the next person. Whether this is some form of social distancing or self-isolation, whatever it might be, sure, but we are looking towards those kind of technologies in order to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. And yes, I do believe that it will prompt or stimulate this kind of thinking in the workplace.
They're not perfect, though, are they? I mean, everyone's sort of thrown a phone down or come close to punching their computer because the Skype just doesn't work.
And then you've got to add load shedding on top of that. So yes, we do have our challenges, but I think that we do have measures to try and mitigate that.
There's a big conversation as well, so as I understand it, the Labour Relations Act and the law basically specifies quite clearly what sick leave is, when you qualify for it, how that works, when you need a doctor's note, whether that doctor's note is acceptable, although judges sometimes disagree on these things. But there's nothing in the Act, as I understand it, for what you would call sort of quarantine leave or self-isolation leave, where a doctor or government, in this case, says to someone, look, you've just got off a plane from Italy, you were part of that group of people who went to Italy, you're not one of the 13, but please stay at home. I mean, there's nothing there that governs that. That person just loses the income. You're
absolutely correct. And I must say, I think the COVID-19 virus is really in a league of its own, and the reaction to it has been really quite amazing. On the issue of sick leave, there's a common misconception that you can take sick leave even though you're in a quarantine state, and that is not true. You're only entitled to sick leave if you are indeed sick, and in order to substantiate that, you may need a diagnosis and a medical certificate from a qualified and certified medical practitioner in order for your employer to recognize it. The biggest challenge that we do have is that when people go into self-isolation, they may not be able to claim sick leave in the ordinary sense, but what they can do, perhaps, is to look at unpaid leave or perhaps even working from home, as we've discussed earlier, or come up with some kind of short-time arrangement with their employer in order to mitigate that risk.
And would a WhatsApp from the health minister asking you to stay at home, would that help?
It depends on your relationship with your employer, but not necessarily, not for sick leave purposes.
Okay. I've heard it suggested that there could be some form of emergency regulation. In other words, at the moment, as you say, there's no provision for this.
Yes.
But could, without actually going through Parliament, which we know takes quite a long time, would the Labour Minister, I presume it would be the Minister of Labour and Employment, Tulis Mngeti, who would have to do this, could a regulation be issued on a sort of emergency basis to try and cover this in some way?
I think so, yes. I would be very interested to see the form that it would take, and of course that kind of regulation would have to carefully balance the interests of employers and employees in order to minimize the impact on the economy, because that's one of Donald Trump's biggest concerns, is the impact that this virus would have on the US economy, for instance. We've seen the impact that it has had on the Chinese economy, which was quite devastating. So at the end of the day, I think regulation in South Africa, albeit temporary, could be useful, but I would be very interested to see what form it would take.
All right, Michael Yeates, thank you very much indeed. Do appreciate it. The Director in the Employment Practice of the law firm Klipdecker Hofmeyr joining us here this afternoon with the latest on that.